Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio. Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Holly Fry.
And I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
And this is a continuation of our two-part episode on the invention of the MRI and the arguments around who invented it.
Yeah.
And when we left off on part one, Dr. Ray Damadian had filed for a patent on his idea to create a machine that used nuclear magnetic resonance to capture diagnostic data by scanning a human body. But he had not yet built it. So we're going to pick right up from that point today. So I'm just going to tell you now, if you didn't listen to part one, go back and get all of the baseline groundwork that had to be done in physics before we could get to this point.
I would say we have two-parters where you can get the second part if the first part, but I would say this is not one.
This is not one.
You need part one before part two.
Yeah, you do. And so then today's episode is going to take us through the building of the first MRI machine, how changes were made to the methodology that machine used, and into the very recent past as people have continued to hash out who exactly should get credit for the invention of the MRI.
Raymond Damadian was completely enthusiastic about the possibilities of magnetic scanning technology, and once he had filed for a patent, he set out to build a working body scanner. But this is definitely not something that other people believed in right away. To a lot of people, it just seemed too far beyond imagining to think there would ever be a way to scan an entire living person. Damadian later recounted, quote, "Going from the first test of the experiment to construction of Indomitable and the first human scan, we had significant numbers of people forecasting that it was beyond any prospect of going from a tiny test tube to a human body and overcoming all the technological obstacles." And to be clear, this was a huge jump in how NMR could be used. It is one thing to analyze a very small sample that's been collected and can be contained in a test tube. Very different thing to analyze a living human body. This is comes up all the time in medical developments where something works in a petri dish. Will it work in a full human being?
Yeah. And the first big obstacle to building this machine, which Damadian referenced in that quote by its name, Indomitable, was building a magnet big enough that a person could fit inside of it. He and a small team eventually managed to make one using an estimated 30 miles of niobium titanium wire wrapped on a cylinder to create their superconductor. The Indomitable also had a helium cooling system, but that was problematic. It leaked. It started to become really expensive to maintain. One estimate said that it was racking up maintenance expenses at roughly $8,000 a month, which is an awful lot for one component of a machine when you were trying to be a startup and get this off the ground. This homemade MRI would look both familiar and a little bit alien to anyone who has had an MRI recently. The subject was moved into it on a platform, just like the way you would be today, but that platform was made of wood. And the scannee also had to wear an antenna coil that was built onto a cardboard vest. It looks very kind of 1950s sci-fi when you see pictures of the first people doing this. The information from that antenna then traveled to an oscilloscope, which then parsed and fed the information to a mini computer, and that mini computer could take that information and generate an image.
Once this machine was built, Damadian was eager to be its first test subject. That meant nobody needed to get permission or approval from the school's administration. Had they been looking for a volunteer from outside the team, there would have been red tape involved. But once Damadian bravely entered the Indomitable on May 11th, 1977, nothing happened. The team was completely dejected. Damadian came to the conclusion that he had too much body fat insulating his tissues, and the coil they were using could not get a signal through it. As they worked on the machine over the next few weeks, Ray Damadian's health was closely monitored, but he never showed any kind of sign of side effects from this experiment.
Yeah, they came to the conclusion that their coil and antenna were not strong enough, but they couldn't really backtrack and rebuild that part. So they were just trying to figure out how they could go forward. And then once the team was ready for another test, it was Larry Minkoff, who was a graduate student working under Damadian, who volunteered. He had been the one monitoring Damadian for any possible problems after the first test, and he was very confident it was safe. He also was a very slender gentleman, so they were not as worried about that issue of body fat blocking the signal from coming through. And so he got into the MRI, and it took 5 hours, but it worked. The resulting image was really rudimentary, though. The team actually had to reconstruct it by drawing it out with colored pencils and then to get a quick image. And then a computer-generated version was made using data points that were collected during the scan. There were 106 data points that had to be used. But again, this is in the 70s, so when we say computer-generated, this is very different than what you might think of today.
Damadian founded the Phonar Corporation on the heels of that first successful scan with the intent to start building scanners to market to the medical community. He later noted his excitement about this technology in an interview, stating, quote, "Once we had been able to see that scanning the human body was real and could be accomplished, you wanted to be part of that. You didn't want to be just a shoreline observer as the ship sailed off into the horizon."
And Damadian scans were pretty incredible. This was a huge advance over anything that had existed before. But if you look at one of those early scans, even after it had been rendered by a computer with all of those data points, it still looks very rudimentary compared to what you would see an MRI do today. The images are very blocky with very little detail. It's kind of like if you had an MRI done by Minecraft. While Damadian announced after this that they had created a way to detect cancer anywhere in the human body, detractors noted that the generated image could easily be misinterpreted because it was so crude, and also that a bias from excitement over this new tech could play a part in an incorrect interpretation. But Damadian had never really stated in his patent or in his research notes that what he was after was imagery. He was after data, and then that data could be used to create visual images. But the biggest problem in all of it was that there was this degree of guesswork involved in the whole thing. Sometimes it wasn't really clear where precisely the information that they were using was coming from in the human body. So while it was possible to see that there was, for example, unhealthy tissue, clearly pinpointing that unhealthy tissue's location was not exactly guaranteed.
As Damadian and his team were working on the Indomitable, another scientist, Paul Lauterbur, was working out his own way to make use of Damadian's early ideas. Paul Lauterbur was born in Sydney, Ohio on May 6, 1929. He described his childhood home as full of animals, dogs, and then, quote, birds, turtles, fish, snakes, and other animals, and surrounded by outdoor places where he played and explored. His father was an engineer who was part owner of a company that built machinery for bakeries, and his mother was a housewife. Paul attended parochial school, which he later said he didn't have much memory of. He had an aunt on his father's side named Anna Lauterbur, who was a teacher. She got him interested in natural history, and he wrote later in his life that she was his favorite aunt.
Yeah, he really makes it sound like she was one of those people that really turned on his brain to the idea of like exploring things you see in the natural world and figuring out what they are and how they work. After attending public high school, Lauterbur went on to Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio, where he studied chemistry, although his father had really hoped he would major in engineering instead. But after he got his Bachelor of Science, Lauterbur described being, quote, tired of lectures and professors and determined to go back to lab work. He got a job with Dow Corning, specifically at their lab at the Mellon Institute, which came with the opportunity to take graduate courses at the University of Pittsburgh for free if he wanted. He did eventually take some of those. He mentions in some of his writing that he kind of got over his chagrin over academia and was like, yeah, sure, I'll take some more classes. But it was while he was with Dow Corning that he learned about nuclear magnetic resonance.
He later wrote of his early interest in NMR, quote, "It seemed ideally suited, even at that early date, for investigating the structure and electron distributions in molecules and various physical properties of materials. Therefore, as part of my graduate education at the University of Pittsburgh, in addition to a literature seminar on interstellar molecules, I gave one on a paper describing NMR properties of rubber. Before I could begin a planned collaboration on the hydrogen NMR spectroscopy of silicon compounds, however, my deferments came to an end and I was drafted into the Army. When his time in the military ended, he returned to the Mellon Institute, in part because they offered to buy him an NMR machine of his own to work with. He immediately started research with it, starting with a survey of carbon compounds. He used that work to complete his PhD, which opened up more professional opportunities, and soon he was offered an associate professor job at the State University of New York at Stony Brook. That also let him set up an NMR lab.
Coming up, we'll talk about the chance event that led Lauterbur to start thinking about the use of NMR as a medical diagnostic tool. But first, we're going to pause for a sponsor break. During this period in Lauterbur's life, he observed a postdoc named Leon Sarian that was essentially recreating and repeating Ray Damadian's rat tissue experiments, comparing the NMR relaxation times between healthy tissues and tumorous tissues. Lauterbur wrote of this experience, quote, "I was there to observe the experiments and noted that large and consistent differences were observed for specimens from all parts of the sacrificed animals and that the experiments seemed well done. Some individuals were speculating that similar measurements might supplement or replace the observations of cell structure in tissues by pathologists, but the invasive nature of the animal procedure was distasteful to me, the data too complex, and the sources of differences too obscure to be relied upon for medical decisions. As I pondered the problem that evening, I realized that there might be a way to locate the precise origins of NMR signals in complex objects, and hence to form an image of their distributions in 2 or even 3 dimensions."
Building on that idea, in 1973, Paul Lauterbur coined the term zoomatography. He created a 2-dimensional image using gradients in the magnetic field, and then he started essentially stacking the 2D images that work produced to create 3D ones. He was solving a problem that was inherent in Damadian's method of capturing data, that problem of uncertainty regarding location of the source of an NMR signal. Lauterbur wrote a paper on this method of using NMR titled Image Formation by Induced Local Interactions, examples employing nuclear magnetic resonance. His work was much more focused on getting an image than just collecting data, an important departure from Damadian's work. When he submitted that paper to Nature, it was initially rejected. Lauterbur resubmitted with an explanatory cover letter and was asked to edit his paper to draw a more direct line to the possible applications of his method.
That year, there was also a development going on across the Atlantic at the University of Nottingham. Sir Peter Mansfield realized that changing the magnetic field would reveal a chemical's anatomic structure. This was actually pretty similar to the work that Lauterbur was doing, but Mansfield hadn't read or even known about Lauterbur's paper. This is kind of a bit of an echo of the way that Bloch and Purcell, which we talked about in the first part of this, were both coming to similar conclusions through slightly different routes 3 decades earlier. Mansfield had also been doing work that shortened the length of time required for an MRI. That's called the echoplanar method today, which captured all of the data from a 2D plane after just a single magnetic pulse, rather than just a section of a 2D plane at a time. So it wasn't like you had to do any image in a segment of several pieces. You could do it all in one go. Mansfield is credited with tightening up the mathematics needed to significantly improve the MRI machine's data analysis.
In 1980, Damadian's Phonar Corporation introduced the first commercially available MRI machine. In 1985, just 1 year after the Food and Drug Administration approved the use of MRI, Phonar produced a mobile version of an MRI machine. This variation enabled MRIs to be performed on patients when moving them was too risky. They can be used in ambulances and emergency scenarios outside of a hospital, like when there's a disaster or another event. Almost as soon as MRI machines started to be adopted by the medical community, the term nuclear magnetic resonance shifted and started to be called magnetic resonance imaging. This, according to a New York Times write-up, got away from the potentially problematic nuclear association. This is not what it meant, really, but it could be associated with like nuclear power and nuclear weapons.
All of this going on during the Cold War.
Right. The use of imaging also meant that this folded in nicely to the field of radiology.
Also in 1985, Dr. Paul C. Lauterbur was one of the recipients of the Lasker Medical Research Award, which since 1945 has recognized what are believed to be the greatest contributions to medical science each year. The Lasker Awards are sometimes called the American Nobels, and they are considered to be, to some degree, a predictor of Nobel candidates. When Lauterbur won his, he was recognized alongside the three-man team of Dr. Caesar Milstein, Dr. George J.F. Kohler, and Dr. Michael Potter for their work that they had done in antibodies. And in addition to those four men already mentioned, 1985 is also the year that Dr. Henry J. Heimlich received a Lasker Award for his food ejection technique. So it's kind of an interesting time when all of these pieces of medical science are being developed at the same moment.
Yeah, I've thought about doing a Heimlich episode, but number one, that's like a bit more recent, 1985, than we typically cover. And then also I didn't quite come together. Anyway. But even in the New York Times write-up about Lauterbur's award, they mentioned Dr. Damadian, stating, quote, while many specialists give Dr. Lauterbur chief credit for introducing NMR as a diagnostic tool, Dr. Raymond Damadian of the Downstate Medical Center of the State University of New York has developed an alternate approach called field-focused NMR, or FONAR. Its imaging method differs from that in the widely used devices based on Dr. Lauterbur's work. This reference to Damadian having done work in the field that didn't receive the award is a little bit of a harbinger of something that would happen 20 years later, which we will talk about in detail.
In 1988, both Damadian and Lauterbur were honored with the National Medal of Technology for their work on MRI tech. This entire debate about all of these issues and their two different approaches is complicated by the fact that FONAR actually adopted Lauterbur's method of capturing images. Damadian still claimed ownership of the idea of the machine, but Lauterbur's work had pretty clearly made the machine more useful and marketable. And Dr. Raymond Damadian was also inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame in 1989.
Almost as soon as FONAR introduced its machines, other companies started working on their own. But Raymond Damadian was very, very protective of his patents, and he went after anyone he believed was infringing on them. Hitachi, Johnson & Johnson, Siemens, Philips Electronics, and General Electric were all companies that developed MRI machines, and FONAR and Damadian went after all of them. Many of these cases dragged on for years. Eventually, all of them but one came to out-of-court settlements with Damadian and his company receiving some sort of payout, although the details of those settlements remained private. The one holdout was General Electric, which claimed that it had been developing its imaging concepts, quote, from the beginning, whatever that meant.
I read that statement and I was like, what's the beginning?
A major setback happened in 1986, though, when a judgment in favor of Damadian in a dispute with Johnson & Johnson was overturned in federal court.
Then in 1997, FONAR and General Electric were still locked in a legal battle about patent rights, and it had gone to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. On June 30th of that year, the appeal did not rule in favor of General Electric, and ultimately, GE was found to be in violation of Damadian's patent rights and was ordered to pay $128 million. This was a huge deal, and it was huge news at the time. This bolstered Damadian's company in two ways. For one, it meant they got a massive financial bump when they really needed it. The company had never really been profitable, and the work that they were doing to develop new versions of MRIs that they had on the drawing board was very expensive, so they really needed that financial backing. But it also cemented Damadian's status as the originator of the idea, even if the methodology of it had shifted in the wake of Lauterbur's work.
And Lauterbur hadn't successfully patented any of his developments. He had tried and had some rejected, and he was working from within an academic institution that thought that pursuing those patents would be more trouble than it was worth. He told the New York Times in 1997, quote, "I was working on images, so the question of the relationship between relaxation times and cancer was irrelevant." He also told the press that he had tried to work things out with Damadian, but that Ray had not wanted to because he felt his claim was clearly supported and there was nothing to work out.
Yeah, there's definitely a weird vibe that we could talk about in behind the scenes where Lauterbur is trying to just be like, I don't know, I'm cool with it. Like Ray was really focused on this thing and I wasn't. And I to this moment don't really know how I feel about any of it. But we'll talk about it. That 1997 ruling led also to a lot of press for Damadian, and he talked about how he was going to expand the business with that money, working on making MRIs less expensive for both hospitals to acquire and for patients to have done. There are numbers in there that we'll talk about in behind the scenes because I kind of cracked up, again, having had one of these recently. Did not get cheaper than what he was talking about then, for sure. He also talked a lot about patent law, which really became a passion for him. He was adamant when it came to the importance of defending patents. He even went to Congress to convince members of Congress not to weaken patent laws. He told the New York Times, quote, "With their marketing and financing strength, big companies don't need to risk doing things first. For entrepreneurs to keep taking risks, they need temporary exclusive rights to their inventions."
In a 2001 interview, Damadian noted, quote, "Curiosity is a major driving force, and the same delight that a child has at seeing something new for the first time is always there for someone in a scientific career. When I got into the scientific arena and saw the prospect of developing a new kind of medical machine, I enjoyed the process of wading right into it and getting directly involved in building such a thing." At that point, his company was working to innovate the MRI even further by creating a machine that allowed the patient to sit upright.
Everyone at this point in the early 2000s seemed to recognize that the MRI had changed medical science really significantly. But it had never been recognized with a Nobel Prize. And we're going to pause here for a sponsor break, and when we come back, we will talk about some of the reasons that scientists thought this was the case, and we'll also talk about the fallout that happened after a Nobel Prize was finally awarded for MRI technology. In 2002, an editorial in the Wall Street Journal by Cameron Stracker noted that it was odd that the MRI, which everyone lauded as such a huge step forward in medical imaging, that even men of science referred to it as miraculous, had never been the subject of a Nobel Prize. Stracker's write-up quotes University of Oregon chemistry professor Hayes Griffiths, who said, quote, "MRI is the perfect candidate for the Nobel. It's something that has improved and advanced medicine in a way no one can argue with."
The article then quotes 1981 Nobel laureate in physics Nicholas Blombergen as saying, quote, "What bothers me is that the institute in Stockholm has not yet awarded the prize for this great discovery. I believe this is partly due to controversy over Damadian's role. The National Academy of Sciences had the same year Damadian gave his quote about curiosity and not wanting to be a mere observer to this thrilling new science, published a commissioned paper that had largely written Damadian out of the MRI story. It claimed that his MRI methodology had not been reliable enough before Paul Lauterbur got involved with the technology.
Finally, the Nobel Committee recognized the importance of the MRI, but it caused a lot of strife in doing so. In 2003, Sir Peter Mansfield and Paul C. Lauterbur shared a Nobel Prize for contribution to physiology and medicine. And this was controversial. They had built on work that Damadian had done, and he felt like he had been left out of his rightful credit. In a statement to the press, Damadian said of the Nobel Prize, quote, "I believed that I deserved one. I came up with the idea for the MRI. I built the first machine, and if there was to be a Nobel Prize for medicine for the MRI, I thought it should go to me."
On December 9th, 2003, Raymond Damadian took out huge ads in the New York Times and the Washington Post. The copy read in part, quote, "The prize pretends to honor discoveries concerning the development of magnetic resonance imaging. Yet the Nobel Committee for Physiology or Medicine decided to exclude from recognition the foundational scientific history of magnetic resonance imaging, scientific history that has been before the committee during the many years Dr. Raymond Damadian has been nominated for the prize for the MRI. They have chosen instead to award the prize to two men who contributed nothing more than improved ways to image the MR signals from cancer tissue and healthy tissue that Raymond Damadian discovered." He reportedly spent more than $200,000 on his print campaign in the hopes that the Nobel Committee would amend their decision. There was even a mail-in coupon at the bottom of the ad so that readers of the paper could clip it out and mail their support of Damadian to the Nobel Committee. When it became apparent that the effort was fruitless, his statement to the press became, quote, "I've had time to reflect, and I must say, now that I have learnt how easily the Nobel can be manipulated, I have lost almost all respect for the prize. I can even tell you that I am not sure I want it anymore."
One of the rumors that popped up as this controversy boiled over was that it was Damadian's religious beliefs that had held him back from receiving the award. Damadian was a very devout Christian, and he was very vocal about being a creation scientist who believed in the biblical story of God creating Adam and Eve. Another rumor was that Lauterbur had been the decider and that he had made clear that he would not share this honor with Damadian. But in the end, though, all of this remains strictly rumor. Neither of those stories has ever been substantiated. The Nobel Committee chairman at the time, Dr. Hans Ringertz, made a statement to the press that there were no obstacles to Damadian being nominated for the Nobel Prize in the future.
In the midst of all the argument over credit, another completely unexpected person popped up to claim that he too had the idea to use magnetic imaging and that he had it before all the other contenders. This claim was made public in the journal Nature in November 2003 under the headline, "Russian Claims First in Magnetic Imaging." The write-up is by Brian McWilliams, but the inventor at the center of it is Vladislav Ivanov. According to the write-up, Ivanov was serving as a lieutenant in the Red Army when he was given the task of using NMR for aircraft navigation. They were using it to image water, and Ivanov thought that it could be used to image the human body. He's quoted in the article saying, quote, "I figured that because a person is made up primarily of water, the same method could be used in research on living organisms. The water inside a person could be used to give a signal showing what exists or is located inside."
And there is, according to the article, a document from 1960 that Ivanov filed with the USSR State Committee for Inventions and Discovery titled Method of Examination of the Internal Structure of Material Bodies that laid out this whole idea. It's kind of the same idea as like a patent application. But Ivanov wasn't especially worried about trying to legally challenge anyone over any of this. His idea had not been understood or approved by the administration in Soviet Russia, who thought that his filing it was actually evidence that the lieutenant just had too much free time. Ivanov also seemed amused with Damadian and thought it was difficult to impossible to contain things like MRI technology, noting, quote, "Besides, there are always mistakes when you have major advances in science. You can't keep an idea in one place. They have their own momentum."
Dr. Damadian died just 2 years ago at the age of 86 on August 3rd, 2022 in Woodbury, New York, of cardiac arrest. His New York Times obituary walked through all of the many legal and professional battles that were involved in his work in MRI technology. His company Phonar is still in business, though its focus has shifted more to managing scanning centers and offering service on existing tech. If you visit the company website, it says on the landing page, the inventor of MR scanning.
Because Nobel documents used to determine the awarding of prizes are kept confidential for 50 years, we will have to wait until 2053 to know why the committee chose to honor Lauterbur and Mansfield over Ray Damadian.
But perhaps the bigger question is not who should get credit for this invention, but how and why concepts of invention and ownership are established and whether they need to be re-examined. As a coda, here's a quote from a paper written by Amit Prasad titled The Amorphous Anatomy of an Invention, the Case of Magnetic Resonance Imaging, which was published in the Social Studies of Science in 2007. Quote, in this paper, I analyzed the priority dispute between Damadian and Lauterbur over the invention of MRI. My attempt to clarify the debate, however, does not intend to assign priority to one of the scientists. Instead, through an analysis of this priority dispute, I will problematize notions of discovery and invention. I will show how the process of laying claim to an invention or discovery is negotiated, even while the outcomes of the negotiations remain open-ended. In particular, I will throw light on interplay between the institution of authorship and technoscientific practices in the process of defining a particular technoscientific event as a discovery or an invention, and particular scientists as discoverer or inventor.
I really love that quote when I was looking at that paper because it really did open my mind to like, oh gosh, you kind of instinctively know, yes, when someone patents a thing, they don't really know what it could become. But this really did focus that concept to me of like, people are arguing over their claims to stuff when they didn't know what they were really making a claim on. I understand the financial aspect and capitalism of all of it, but it still made me go like, oh, science has this one big problem where we don't know what's going to happen. The unpredictability of the future leads to some big problems with this. So that is, I'm sure if you are a person that works in MRI tech, you're like, you left out a bunch of stuff, even with 2 episodes. Yeah, I know. There's a lot that went on there. So hopefully we hit the most important parts. I just thought it was a really fascinating examination of the way that these things can explode and become important, but also be something that people grapple with for a long time. I have a fun listener email about another person who is famous for his, I don't know that invention is quite the right way, but for his product. This is from our listener, Ellen, who writes, hi, Tracy and Holly. Sorry, no cute animals, but thank you for the popcorn podcast. I met Orville Redenbacher in Valparaiso, Indiana. I attended Valparaiso University in the early 1980s, and the town had a popcorn festival in early September. His factory was about 5 miles away, and on days that the company tested the popcorn, you could get a large garbage bag of popcorn for $5, unless it was for a school, church, or youth group. It was free for the groups. Groups on campus would sell unpopped popcorn to raise money. I love this. I kind of love that they just, listen, Orville Redenbacher is one of those dudes who always seemed really cool and nice and like just a good, kind person, and I love that this kind of holds that up. Like his company was like, free popcorn for anyone that wants it, which let me tell you, I would be driving up with my car every day they did a test.
Same.
Give them $20, fill that car with popcorn, get out of Dodge and eat myself silly. Thank you for telling us about that, because that's a really wonderful story, and I'm a little jealous you got to meet him. If you would like to write to us, you can do so at historypodcast@iHeartRadio.com. You can also subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done that already. That is easy as pie on the iHeartRadio app or anywhere you listen to your favorite shows.
Stuff You Missed in History Class is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.